and let's get started. So today I'm really so excited and delighted to have Dr. Jason Ruiz from the University of Notre Dame here to speak about a project that he's been working on for a couple of years now, at least, that I learned about. And I think it's just an amazing project. So let me tell you a little bit about what he's going to be speaking on, and then a little bit about him, and then I'll turn everything over to Dr. Ruiz. So today's talk is called Latinx Murals of Pilsen, a digital toolkit for researching and exploring public art in Chicago. And as you'll learn, Dr. Ruiz has developed this amazing digital public history project that documents the Latinx public art in the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago, which has been a center for muralism and public art making since the 1960s. But it has also been undergoing gentrification, which for my students in my urban history class, we're going to be talking about a lot in the next couple of weeks, and is already a topic that has come up previously over the course of the semester. So what happens when a neighborhood is changing? When the people who live there are changing, what happens to those people? What happens to the public art that is there? So we're going to hear a lot about that from Dr. Ruiz. So let me tell you a little bit more about who he is. Dr. Jason Ruiz is Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He told me to shorten his bio, but I'm not going to, because he should get all of the flowers, right? I mean, he's done amazing stuff. So he's an Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame, where he's affiliated faculty with the program in Gender Studies and the Institute for Latino Studies. He teaches courses in Latinx Studies, Race and Representation, Queer Studies, and Popular Culture. His first book was Americans in the Treasure House, Travel to Porfirian Mexico and the Cultural Politics of Empire, which was published in 2014. And he's got this really cool new book coming out next year, which is going to be on popular culture, latinidad, and the war on drugs, which just sounds absolutely fascinating and fantastic. So I am super excited. So let me turn it over to Dr. Ruiz for his presentation. So thank you again. Really can't say how much I appreciate you being here. And I'm going to stop talking. So it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm really excited to be joining your students today and to be talking more about this project that, as you said, is something that is very near and dear to my heart. It's especially good because to be here because Dr. Mary Rizzo's research is, of course, an inspiration to me, and we're both fellows with the Whiting Foundation, and hearing more about her amazing work on Baltimore and public history and rehabilitating this literary magazine is really inspiring and continues to inspire me along the way. I actually have not had many opportunities to talk about this project outside of Notre Dame and other settings, so I'm really thrilled to talk with a totally different audience, this class and hopefully some additional, it looks like some additional people at Rutgers Newark. So my idea was that this would be more of a conversation. That's a little hard when we're on Zoom. So I really want to encourage you, please, you can interrupt me by with the chat. I have empowered Annie and Mary to interrupt me as much as they possibly want to, and feel free to chime in anytime that you want. I also want to say this is a work in progress. So I really take seriously and truly value any feedback that you might have for where we should go next. So I think I'm going to start with my slides and introduce you to a neighborhood. Give me 1 second. I warned Dr. Rizzo that I'm a little rusty on PowerPoint or on Zoom lately, so give me 1 second. I'm going to go there. Am I there? Can you tell me in the chat if you can see it? It looks good. Thank you so much. So as Mary said, this project is devoted to the Pilsen murals in the city of Chicago, and I want to kind of start by introducing you to a little bit about where that is. This is a representation of Chicago and where the Pilsen community is in relationship Pilsen to the city center. So if you can see my arrow here, this is downtown Chicago. This is called the Chicago Loop. This is the state of Illinois. And as you can see, Pilsen, number 31 in the red. Chicago has 76 community areas. Pilsen is considered the near west side, which is really, its physical location is actually going to be really relevant to this project, especially when we start talking about gentrification. I am so pleased that I get to present this right before you will explore the topic of gentrification, because as I'm going to argue several times over the next 20 minutes or so, Pilsen is a really important case study for understanding gentrification in general, not just in Chicago, but as a representation of what's happening in close in neighborhoods in a lot of cities in the United States right now. So this is really important. And I hope that you'll see it's really generalizable to other communities and even some of the places you might be from originally. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on Pilsen and show you a little more about where Pilsen is physically located. As I said, we have the Chicago Lakeshore, some very valuable real estate. We have the South Side here, and Pilsen is like I said, the lower West Side, the near West Side. And I'll tell you about some of the neighboring communities. This is Little Village, and which is also largely Mexican immigrant neighborhood and Latinx neighborhood. This is Mary, can you see my pointer? Like I'm pointing on my own computer. I don't know if it's registering with you guys.
I
Yeah,
can
I
see
think we
it.
can see it. Yeah.
Great. So this is Pilsen. Pilsen is a really important neighborhood for the history of Chicago. It is a historical gateway community. A first place where new I can't say authentic Czech or Polish architecture, but it's kind of reminiscent of the Czech and Polish communities that a lot of the original inhabitants of Pilsen would have been from. So they built a neighborhood in the mid to late 19th century that attempted to recall or harken back to where they came from in Europe. As you probably know, you're from a major urban center, or at least attending university in a major urban center. Ethnic turnover is an important part of any neighborhood's history. And the ethnic turnover that we see in Pilsen really starts in the 1950s and 1960s, was really looking to revitalize the very close-in core of the city of Chicago. So neighborhoods like Little Italy, just north of Little Italy here is the University of Illinois Chicago. And these were original gateway communities in the late 19th century up until the 1960s that harken back to previous generations, but there's not exactly an Italian ethnic identity of Little Italy. Right up here is Greektown, and there's a very similar situation in which these ethnic communities are, I hope it doesn't sound cynical, these neighborhoods are branded in ways related to their original ethnic enclaves, but are no longer ethnic enclaves themselves. So that's going to be really important for what I talk about later when I'm interested in and curious about the future of the Pilsen neighborhood and whether or not Pilsen might eventually look more like that, where it is branded as ethnically Latinx or Mexican in particular, but no longer is home to those communities. Urban renewal and slum clearance profoundly affected these neighborhoods. I love that I'm pointing at a Whole Foods market, because you know what kind of neighborhood a Whole Foods market is typically located in. As you can see, these early ethnic neighborhoods by the 1950s were slums, and the Daley administration was desperate to revitalize these inner city neighborhoods. So it practiced what a lot of cities in slum clearance, turning slums, just demolishing entire neighborhoods to turn them into, to repurpose them for other purposes. So would be the University of Illinois, Chicago, which was on land originally in this area, home to a really thriving multi-ethnic neighborhood. So you had Black Chicagoans, Italian Chicagoans, Puerto Rican and Mexican Chicagoans, all American ethnic history and the progressive era, this sort of community, this social service organization that provided direct services for better or worse, that included Americanization programs, was located here, really speaking to the historical importance of these neighborhoods. The Daley administration actually engaged in slum clearance to create a college campus here, which meant that the people living in this community, this multi-ethnic, multiracial community, were spread throughout different parts of the city. So this is a really interesting case study for the resegregation of certain parts of Chicago. So here you had an interracial, interethnic community, and it fragmented and split into and sent people into different directions. So the Puerto Ricans moved this way toward a neighborhood called Humboldt Park. The Mexicans all tended to move here toward the Pilsen area in the 1960s, and African Americans tended to move south toward the south side of Chicago. This is really interesting for the story of Pilsen and central to the story of Pilsen, because that is how Pilsen becomes so Mexican in the 1950s and 1960s. By this time period, the children and grandchildren of the original Eastern European immigrants moved into whiteness, moved into other parts of the city, really got Americanized. They no longer were very beholden to an ethnic identity related to their immigrant grandparents or parents. So they started to move out of Pilsen around the same time, which is precisely when Mexicans and Mexican Americans and a couple other of ethnic groups and a few Puerto Ricans, but they mostly went to Humboldt Park. This neighborhood, the Mexican community of Chicago, became extremely concentrated into this neighborhood, so that by the 1970s and the 1980s, Pilsen became overwhelmingly Mexican. I'm talking 90 to 95% Mexican in terms of its ethnicity. I'm using Mexican as a blanket term for Mexican or Mexican American here. So you have a very thriving Latinx community here, but that's now changing a few decades later, or now many decades later, as Pilsen undergoes gentrification. So a lot of Mexican Americans have moved into this community, the Little Village neighborhood, which is a little further out, but still kind of considered an inner city neighborhood. But when I started doing research for this project, I was super shocked that Pilsen is now something like 60% Latinx in terms of self-identification on the 2020 US Census. But a lot of Mexicans have moved, or Mexican identified people have moved to Little Village, but also surprisingly inner ring suburbs. So for example, the inner ring suburb of Cicero, Illinois, which if you've ever flown into Midway Airport, it's directly connected to Midway Airport, which no, Midway is technically in the city of Chicago, but it's kind of surrounded by Cicero. Cicero is now 90% Latino identified. So you get this sort of suburbanization of Chicago's Mexicans, which creates a very interesting dynamic in terms of the subject matter of the project that I asked you to poke around a little bit by sending Dr. Rizzo the web link. It creates a very interesting dynamic in that this neighborhood is no longer, demographically speaking, the most Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. In fact, it's now sort of the Latino population of several suburbs now outnumber the Mexicans of Pilsen. But one thing that's absolutely crucial to, you talked about Cicero, Raisin in the Sun. Perfect. The dynamics of that you read about in Raisin in the Sun are absolutely relevant, because the play, as I remember, it's been a few years, so correct me if I'm wrong, is about some of the first African-American families to move into Cicero, because Cicero had historically been an all-white inner ring suburb in Chicago. Fast forward about 30 years after Raisin in the Sun, and you see Latinos really taking over as the, by and large, very dominant ethnic group in Cicero. So interesting correlation there between that and Raisin in the Sun. Okay, so this is all to say the dynamics in Pilsen are super fascinating right now because Pilsen is becoming increasingly less Latino. But at the very same time, Pilsen remains the heart and soul of Latino Chicago. So if we polled 1,000 Chicagoans and said, what is the spiritual home to Latino Chicago? I guarantee you the overwhelming majority would claim that Pilsen is really the heart and soul of Chicago. But as Dr. Rizzo hinted at, and as I've suggested, Pilsen is now undergoing rapid gentrification. Here is one of many hundreds of articles you could find if you are interested in visiting Chicago about the hottest neighborhood, the most exciting neighborhood. And Pilsen is also considered one of the hottest real estate markets in the city for all of these reasons. I need to stress up front that one of the things that makes Pilsen so, yeah, that shocked face that came up on one of the emoji responses is exactly my reaction to this, because you have a neighborhood that has historically been neglected by the city, becomes the hottest neighborhood in the city. Old story, we've seen that before. Gentrification is not being invented in Pilsen. We know that, but there is something interesting going on in terms of public art, which is really where I want to turn. Starting in the 1960s and 1970s, Latino artists and other artists of color created hundreds of murals all over the Pilsen neighborhood. This is not by a Latino artist. This isn't by the artist Jeff Zimmerman, who is an Anglo guy, a white guy, but was commissioned by this very Latino church. This is me on a field trip, so I took this picture of some of my students. He created this mural that was commissioned in the early 1990s by this very Latino church. So that's really where I come into this project. I've partnered with a group here at Notre Dame called HUE, which is the Historic Urban Environments Lab that is actually run out of the architecture school. HUE's mission is really important to me and interesting, but it has nothing to do with my own research. So as you can see here, HUE has been dedicated to preserving information and engaging the public with information about the built environment, but going back to like Rome and the seaside community in Florida, which is one of the first new urban communities, or I guess the first new urban community in the United States. They've also been dedicated to preserving information about South Bend's built environment. And what we're doing in this project is applying some of what HUE has done, which is to create websites and mobile apps that engage the public with primary resources about the built environment. We're applying some of their technology and some of what they're doing to muralism in Pilsen, which is nothing like architecture. Well, okay, I guess it's something like architecture. It's about like walls and the built environment, but it's really, I think, first and foremost about public art. I hope that heart is for Selena, because I took this picture when I was just driving around Pilsen one day and I saw an artist actively working on a mural of Selena. So you cannot possibly have Latinx public art without, the queen of everything, Selena, in the mix. So I partnered a few years ago with the HUE team to create a project called Latinx Murals of Pilsen, which, as you saw in my title slide, is really about creating a set of digital tools for people to explore Pilsen, whether they are on the streets of Pilsen and murals like this one are in front of them, or whether or not they are have nothing to do with the neighborhood and can't get to Pilsen physically. So we're very interested in creating a suite of digital tools that document and interpret public art traditions in Pilsen for diverse audiences. Our original goal, as you can see here, had two main components, which was to build a digital archive and a mobile app. Our idea was that people could be on an iPhone or iPad or any mobile device, and they could access information about the murals that are right in front of them. Dr. Rizzo and I were at a workshop or conference a couple of years ago, and this expert in public history and in public engagement and engaging the public through with scholarship said, I have to ask, why are you doing a mobile app? No one downloads an app anymore when going to a neighborhood to look at art. Like, what you need is a website that reads well on a phone, that will use less data and just be robust and beautiful and able to engage people with what's in front of them, but without an app. So that really was because it prodded us to move away from a mobile app. And you college age students, I would love to hear your advice on this, whether or not you are likely to download a mobile app. And we have really focused more on the digital archiving part of it. How do we engage streets of Pilsen? I first got this idea because I was teaching a class on Latinos in Chicago and environment, like up to South Bend, which is where I am, which is about 100 miles away. And I found that there was precious little information about the murals. And there was not one place you could go to find out who made this piece of public art. What does it represent? What does the artist think it says to this community? What are some of the controversies or issues surrounding this piece of public art? I was looking for information like that and I couldn't find it. So partnering with you, we decided to build something that would do the work of the type of thing that I was looking for. So let me start with a few non-negotiables. Our project has to be bilingual because many of the residents of Pilsen or people interested in the public art will be Spanish speakers who need a bilingual app, or excuse me, I said app again, who need a bilingual website in order to engage with it in a serious and meaningful way. We are creating resources that can never be monetized. And this one is really important to us because we are coming on the heels of several attempts to monetize the murals of Pilsen. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about public art is because they're just there. They're just available to all of us. And it costs you nothing to engage with a piece of public art in Pilsen. But several companies or cultural institutions have attempted in a few ways to profit from the murals. Let me give you one example. You might have been a tourist in a city. You're very close to New York. I've been a tourist in New York on a double-decker bus. And one of the double-decker bus tours in Chicago launched a project to do double-decker bus tours through the neighborhoods of Pilsen that were deemed as public art tours or muralism tours, and they were charging $60 a head for like a 2-hour tour. And the artists in Pilsen, the Pilsen community, really went nuts because they were very concerned about non-Latinos, non-residents of Pilsen, people from outside the community, especially kind of a faceless corporation like those that own the bus companies, profiting from and monetizing the murals. That's a quick story, which leads me to my third non-negotiable in terms of launching this project, is that it has to be open and accessible to all. We are adamant that we just want to put information into the hands of people, and that really is the heart and soul of our mission. My main partner with Hugh is a librarian, and as you know, a librarian's main task is to help people access information. So that's really her motivation for the project, and I've been inspired and I've learned a lot from that part of the project. One of our partners on this is the National Museum of Mexican Art, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So let me talk about what we've accomplished a little bit so far. When I say we've built relationships with Pilsen cultural workers, that includes the National Museum of Mexican Art. It includes many of the artists. It includes a few nonprofit organizations. It includes members of the community and grassroots organizations as well. But as Dr. Rizzo can attest, as you probably know from your class already, doing any community-based research really starts with building relationships with the cultural workers who are on the ground doing it. I'll talk about some of the challenges of that in a few minutes. One of the things we've done, or another of the things we've done, is we have digitized archival images. One of my frustrations when I first started this project is that it was very hard to find archival images of muralism in Pilsen. I had this vague sense that muralism started in the mid to late 1960s in the Pilsen neighborhood, but I could find very little archival evidence. Sometimes, like if I was doing a newspaper search, I could find that a newspaper like the Chicago Sun-Times might have written a story on a new mural coming into the fore, being completed or something in the 1970s or 1980s, but the image would be super grainy. So an intern and I went to the Chicago History Museum, and to my total amazement, there were were almost no images in like the archives of the city of Chicago, which is home to like this amazing cultural works. They had documented almost none of the murals. And then I got lucky because I contacted the Chicago Public Art Group, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to promoting and really commissioning public art in the city of Chicago, also preserving it. And it was one of these things where like I went to the big fancy archive at the Chicago History Museum and found nothing. And then my two interns and I went to the Chicago Public Art Group just to like sniff around and see like, we're super desperate for older images of murals in Pilsen. And they said, well, yeah, we don't really have anything, but you know, what you could do is look in that file cabinet, there might be something. So what we found were about 600 images that were just slides in plastic folders and hanging folders of the most important images we could have possibly found. Here are just a couple of examples, because they had somewhere along the way, some good soul who bless them, whoever they are. I'm at Notre Dame, it's a Catholic school. I can say bless them, whoever they are, documented murals from the 1960s to the 1980s. And the Chicago Public Art Group had taken their negative images and turned them into slides. I don't mean PowerPoint slides. I mean the old school, like 1.5 by 2 inch slides that you would put in a slide projector. And these folks at the Chicago Public Art Group were so generous that they said, take as many as you want with you. I had that moment where I called my colleague Jennifer, the one that's the librarian that I mentioned, and I got very shaky voice. I'm like, there's thousands of images here, and I think they'll let us use them. And she's like, we have the machine that you put a slide into and it creates a JPEG. So what, for the love of God, man, bring those slides and we will digitize them, which we've done. So now we have hundreds of images that are historic from the Pilsen, really create what I think is the only archive of public art in Pilsen. These are some old stuff. This is some older images. I'm not even really sure where some of these come from. I know the lower right comes from Casa Aztlán, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but I'm not even sure where some of the other images represent. Especially the two on the left are just completely long gone, but we're continuing to sort of doggedly pursue information about that. So the Chicago Public Art Group was amazing, and it fits in with our mission, which is to digitize as much as we can and to create an archival slide. And this sounds a lot fancier than it is. This is really 2 classes on the murals that I've taught. We have created what we think is a comprehensive survey of the murals. This might be a little misleading because it looks like each dot represents a mural, but this was students pinning where they saw a mural. So like right here, there's actually murals on all these 4 corners, but there's not like 20 murals like you see here. But what it means is that the concentration of dots show us where the public art is, because that's where students pinged their murals. That's another example. There's murals on both sides, and using GPS technology, the students are able to show us exactly where they are. So on part 2 of what we've accomplished so far, we have conducted long-form interviews with 8 Pilsen artists, and we have more on the way. This, I have to say, is my favorite part of the project because I get to conduct a lot of the interviews and I get to meet some of the most fascinating people in Chicago. These are 4 working artists who have created murals in Pilsen. And what we've really tried to do, especially earlier, this is actually pre-pandemic, but we can do this again. What we've tried to do is interview artists whenever possible in front of their works. And these are just, I shouldn't play favorites, but these are 4 of my favorite artists, and I'll maybe talk about them a little bit in Q&A. This guy on the lower right, Miguel de Riel, created this Virgin of Guadalupe. Sam Kirk has created lots of public art in Chicago related to feminism and GLBTQ issues. Hector Duarte is on the upper right, is one, along with Marcos Raya, are 2 of the old school Pilsen artists that have been working in the city since the early 1970s. These are like kind of like, Mary, forgive me for the slang, but these are like OG Pilsen artists, and they have the opposite personalities. Like Marcos Raya, as you can see, is like still a hipster in his 70s, and like has the ego to match it. And this guy, Hector Duarte, who is one of my favorite Pilsen artists, is like the most humble, down to earth, down to earth person you can imagine. So one of my favorite things, and part of the reason why I highlight these four, is that they're so different. These artists all have different missions, different reasons for putting paint on walls in the neighborhood. And but they all have something in common. They are Pilsen artists, but they're four very different people. I've now taught 2 hands-on classes at Notre Dame related to the subject matter. Here are my students doing some of the work. Here I have a little image from Chicago Fire. You can see a Pilsen mural in the background. And here's Hector Duarte, who I mentioned, talking with my Notre Dame class. We've also been focused on documenting artist studio spaces whenever possible, because all of these muralists start their work in a studio, sketching, getting inspiration, working with what's called cartoons in the muralism world. So they start planning and plotting their muralism. This is Marcos Raya, the guy was in the lower left. This is his studio, which is one of like the coolest spaces I've ever been in, sort of a drafty old loft. One thing that's really interesting about this studio space is that it's not in Pilsen. Marcos Raya had worked in Pilsen for 40 years. And then something super depressing happened. He got priced out of Pilsen, like a lot of artists. I don't know if I have a work of Sandra. Another artist was telling us a similar story. One thing that we have found is that the Pilsen artists are moving to neighborhoods with cheaper rents. So this studio is further out from Pilsen than other artist studios. This is in the Bridgeport neighborhood, which is still kind of an inner city neighborhood, but has a ton of cheap, unheated warehouse space. And one of the artists that I mentioned, or actually 2 of the artists that we've worked with now have moved their studios to Cicero. So they've moved from Pilsen proper into the suburbs. I can't help but point out that Marcos Raya, I just noticed this, has an 18th Street street sign. 18th Street is the central corridor of Pilsen. So it's somewhat poignant that he's still identified with the neighborhood, even though, to be frank, he can no longer afford to live or work in the neighborhood. I have talked for way longer than I said I would, Dr. Rizzo, so I apologize, but I'll talk about 3 or 4 challenges and questions that have arisen as we've engaged in this research. The first one has not made me many friends in the public art history world, as Dr. Rizzo can attest, because she saw me get yelled at a meeting once about this. But one thing I'm very interested in is the question of cultural workers and the roles that they play as gatekeepers in terms of public art. Here's how I'll put it. No one owns the streets of Pilsen. Sure, individual buildings are owned, but Pilsen as a collective kind of neighborhood canvas does not belong to anyone. So one of the things that we have found out as outsiders who are at an elite university, 100 miles away from Pilsen, is that several cultural workers have emerged as the gatekeepers of Pilsen to tell us who we can talk to, who we can't talk to, which murals are important and which aren't. There's a lot of, this won't surprise anyone who's done sort of nonprofit work or grassroots organizing. There's a lot of infighting among cultural organizations. So the National Museum of Mexican Art will not work with a certain organization that I won't mention. And that organization told us that they won't work with the National Museum of Mexican Art. One of our approaches in this project has to claim like agnosticism, like we are a nonprofit educational organization. We have no dog in the fight. We will not profit from the murals of Pilsen. Therefore, we are agnostic. You all fight between yourselves, and we are going to just do the nerdy research part of this. That has worked and it doesn't work. I hope that no one's in the audience is parent or loved one is on the board of the National Museum of Mexican Art. But certain staff people there have been incredibly welcoming and have shared so much knowledge with us and have championed our project. And then others have said, you have no right to study the Pilsen murals unless you grew up here, unless you currently live in Pilsen, unless you pay artists anything that they ask for. You have no right to explore what these murals are and what they mean. So this has been really challenging for me. The fact that there are fights that have been going on for decades on the streets of Pilsen over ownership and over who has the kind of curatorial claims on the public art that we have nothing to do with. And that has been a real challenge in getting this project underway. If you want to know in the Q&A, I will tell you about some of the other fights that we see happening in Pilsen that, again, we sort of say like, that's between y'all, at the same time that that certain organizations or individuals make it difficult to actually do the research. The number two, I think, really relates to what you're going to do next if you're in the class, because the project has inflamed some questions that were already in place in my heart and soul when we started the project, which is the question of gentrification. As I've said, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of public art on the city streets in the Pilsen neighborhood. And there's more coming every single week, every single month. Right now, I close my blinds, but it's snowing in the Midwest. So the painting season is kind of ended right now. But in the 6 or 7 years that I've been doing this project, I have borne direct witness to gentrification. I have seen artists leave the neighborhood. I've seen new murals go up, and this is a trend that is really troubling me right now. How many murals are commissioned by businesses? I've seen a lot of new murals go up that are kind of for-profit and promoting something that's for-profit, as opposed to a reflection of an artist's vision or neighborhood needs. So I think we really need to problematize gentrification here and how we understand it. One of the things that's very confusing and troublesome to me is the question of, can a project like this that celebrates and provides access to information on the murals actually shoot itself in the foot and contribute to gentrification? I'm open to that discussion and open to that criticism. Here's a couple of representations of gentrification. On the right, as you can see there, a statement that you see in a lot of public art right now that's not for profit is that Pilsen is not for sale, but this seems like a little bit lofty and ambitious compared to what's happening with property values and development in the neighborhood right now. On the left is really the most stark case study I can possibly offer of it. And I realize I'm running out of time, but in just about 90 seconds, I'll tell you a quick story. Casa Aztlan started in the 1970s as a full-service community center that had like a lot of stuff that you see in immigrant communities in terms of direct services and programming, English language classes, daycare, computer classes, after-school program for kids. Casa Aztlan was thriving and was really the go-to for new immigrants and also for community activists. You know, you would hold your grassroots organizations meeting in Casa Aztlan. It was sold in, it was no longer used as for all the purposes I just described in the late 1990s. And in the 2010s, just a few years ago, it was sold to a developer who made it condos. And the first thing that the developer did when they bought Casa Aztlan, I don't know if you can see here, but well, you can't, but the building kind of goes on. So it's this part of the building, then here there's a courtyard and there's another one. So this is like a lot of square footage for an inner city neighborhood. The first thing that the developer did is paint it over with what a student of mine who wrote a thesis on this calls developer gray. You know, that sort of hipster gray color that like every condo development uses right now. Yes, it's Che Guevara on the left. This is from the 1970s. So you see Benito Juarez, you see Frida Kahlo, you see some sort of iconic Latinx heroes and heroines on the original murals. The murals continue into that courtyard and onto the next building, by the way. They painted it over with gray, and the community snapped. People started protesting outside. There were bomb threats, there were fire threats, and the developer struck a deal with the community organizers by bringing in a few of the original artists and engaging younger artists to repaint it. So interestingly enough, to Herbert, who asked the question, they no longer use Che Guevara. They use kind of more mainstream, middle of the road Latino icons, especially from Chicago. And they repainted the murals of Casa Aztlan in the aftermath of this huge debacle where they did it. Dr. Rizzo says she knows exactly what color because it's everywhere in Newark. That color, like, I have to admit, like, I painted like part of my house that color. I have to undo it because it is such a cliche at this point. Okay, I'm going to wrap up in 2 minutes and just talk about 2 more challenges or questions that have arisen from the project. One is drawing distinctions between murals and graffiti and commercial works. When we say we are interested in studying muralism in Pilsen, there's a lot of gray area. So just getting gray area. There's a lot of gray area in terms of what constitutes a mural. Is street graffiti, is illicit graffiti activity, is that a mural? Is a mural that is promoting the business that's inside the building, is that a mural or is that an advertisement? There's a lot of discussion to be had about what constitutes a mural. Like I said, we've tended to take sort of an agnostic approach to a lot of these questions, and we've included a lot of stuff that might fall into some of those other categories, such as graffiti or advertisements, for better or worse. And then I'll close by talking about the ephemerality of Pilsen murals. This is not specific to Pilsen. Of course, every mural is ephemeral, but one of the things that I have found super interesting in doing this project is how really rapidly some of the murals change. I'll give you just a couple of examples. This was the side of a tortilla factory called El Popocatépetl. So a Mexican-owned tortilla factory. This is a stop on Pilsen mural tours that I give. And I really loved this piece because I liked how abstract it is. It does use photorealism and sort of make it gigantic to celebrate like the everyday workers of the factory. But the owners had it painted over. This was like one of my favorite stops on the muralism tour. They had it painted over for, okay, how do I put this diplomatically? Very cliched representations of Latinidad, of Mexicanness. Okay, the tortilla factory is called El Popocatépetl, which is this iconic story. If you've ever gotten like a free calendar from a Mexican restaurant, it probably has this kind of imagery on it. It's like one of the foundational myths of Mexico, where this Aztec warrior fell in love with the princess, and then she dies and he dies, and they become the 2 volcanoes that are outside of Mexico City. The owner has every right to paint this over with this, of course, and they're still contributing to the public art in Pilsen, so it's hard to get mad at. However, some murals have been a little more painful to watch go away. This was one of my very favorite murals in Pilsen, painted in the early 2000s, especially around debates with immigrant detention. This is by Jeff Zimmerman, along with members of the community, that really took on family separation and the incarceration of migrant people. And it's across the street from another mural that is like very monumentalist, that celebrates the immigrant experience. So to me, I would take classes there and I would make them look at this gigantic triptych that celebrated the immigrant experience. And then I would say, okay, now everyone turn around and look behind you. And the theme of this mural is actually very dark. It's about this country's relationship to some of those immigrants, locking them up, separating parents from children. And I think it was such a nice, sobering sort of sobering pairing with that one that celebrated the immigrant experience, which the other one that I realize I'm trying to describe a mural that's not in front of you, but it shows people like immigrating, then it shows them getting working class jobs, then it shows them getting like professional jobs and higher education. It's like the oldest story in the book about like immigration. Important, and we need sources of inspiration like that, but it also did not talk about like sort of the darker underbelly of the migrant experience, which I thought this was very much a corrective for. But to my horror, I was giving class tour and I said, I was ready to say everyone turn around, and it was also painted over with gentrifier gray and sandblasted subsequently. So this mural disappeared on us. One of the things that I found so interesting about the ephemeral nature of muralism in Pilsen is that the artists have 100% of the artists I've talked to have made peace with it. And they say, I do not paint a mural to last forever. And the Chicago climate won't allow for that. The shifting sort of politics of a neighborhood won't allow for that. As a muralist, I realize I'm speaking for them. As a muralist, I don't expect my mural to last forever. And I hope that it makes an impact while it's there. So part of this is like an education for me and for my team, that we've had to sort of accept that the murals that we're working on will disappear, but that only makes us more resolute in our attempt to study them and capture them and make them available for public engagement. So I'll stop there and ask for questions, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. That was fantastic. And so while folks are getting their thoughts together to ask questions, and you can feel free to ask questions in the chat, there's also the Q&A box down at the bottom. So we will monitor both of those. But while you're getting your thoughts together for your questions, we have some questions that my students had submitted early. So let me start with one of those. So Adrian asked a sort of background question, which is, why muralism, right? So is there a connection with Latinx culture around muralism that made that the sort of public art form that was adopted and grew in this community?
Yeah. Fabulous question. So the Latino, Latinx, Chicano, Chicanx muralism movement starts in the 1960s, and it's really based on the Mexican muralism movement, which predates it by half a century or so. So if you've seen Diego Rivera, if you've seen Orozco, Siqueiros, you know that like some of the titans of Mexican art, apart from Frida Kahlo, are engaged especially with muralism. This is especially after the 1910 revolution, which was socialist, and the idea was that muralism was socialist art because it was art for the people, and you didn't have to pay to see it. You didn't have to, and you didn't have to pay to, or someone paid for it, but it's not owned by an individual person in a particular sense. So from the 1920s to the 1960s and 70s, Mexican muralism inspires Latino, in the US, Latinx muralism in a very profound way. So one of the artists that I talked about, for example, Hector Duarte, who's now, I think, probably about 70, when he was a kid, when he was, I think, a teenager, he interned with Siqueiros, who is an iconic, important Mexican muralist. And what Duarte did was really take what he learned in Mexico from one of the masters and translate that onto the city streets of Chicago. And muralism, not only in Chicago, but all over the United States, among Latinos, among other ethnic groups, really flourished. But in the Latinx sense, it starts with Mexican muralism, especially. That question of ownership and access is so important for the project. And it also relates to the National Museum of Mexican Art. The museum is free. So the museum is open access. It is highly accessible to people. But as I'm sure Dr. Rizzo can lecture on way more effectively than I can, putting art in a museum changes the meaning of that art. It says, It tells the world this is valuable, this is worthy, this should be displayed, this is important. So I think there's something really fascinating about the fact that the museum is right in the center of the neighborhood, and then all around it is public art that does not have really the baggage of being inside museum walls. And that to me is really important. I don't want to use this project to build museum walls around the murals, which is one of the risks, but that difference between museum art in a museum, which has a certain type of value, both economic and cultural, versus art on the street, that dynamic is fascinating to me.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I feel like, yeah, we could have that conversation for like another hour at least, and that would be amazing. But there are more questions to ask. So let me put together two questions from my students, Stephanie and Brandon. So Stephanie wanted to know, in Pilsen, were the murals like an organized effort to create these murals, or were independent artists sort of just doing it on their own? And it kind of just sort of grew from that. And then Brandon wanted to ask about the chronology. So when did artists in Pilsen start creating these murals? And has it been consistent over time, or were there periods of like sort of more muralism and less? And sort of where are we today with that mural activity? And more, and folks, please use the chat to drop questions in as well. Sorry.
Great. Yeah. And I'd love to see more chat questions. To answer the first question, no, there's no overarching apparatus that organizes muralism. It is ad hoc. It also gets to the second question. It starts in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and it continues really very consistently until today. One thing that might surprise you is that, especially related to like my, very weepy testimony about the ephemeral nature of the Pilsen murals, is that some of those early ones are still there. That very last slide, that is the women's faces that I showed you, is actually a response to a mural that's across the street from it, which is called Galería del Barrio, which is like the gallery of the neighborhood. That was all men's faces. It was supposed to like celebrate and raise up latinidad. But of course, because it's the 70s and like macho politics of the time dictated that it was all men, the women who painted the more contemporary mural, Sam Kirk and Sandra Anton-Giorgi, they did something that I think was so interesting to me, because they repainted, or they painted a response to it, which is those women's faces. And they were very purposefully included like trans women, older women, women from from other sort of identity categories. They did it as sort of a kind of a sassy response to it. But first they retouched the original mural in order to rescue it and save it, which I think like that's one of my favorite like preservation stories, because it's saying that the original piece is problematic, but worthy of restoration, which is what I happen to agree with. And then they say, we're going to present a feminist / queer response to that. I thought was so important. Over time, muralism has ebbed and flowed. I don't have a particular case study, or I can't tell you, I don't have like a chart of when it has ebbed and flowed, but it's a really good question. The 70s stuff flowers and blooms and really creates what we know about muralism. It continues to today. What we see now is like another golden age of muralism in Pilsen. There's artists out there every single day of the week when I'm out there taking pictures or interviewing people. This is really a very active time. The problem with that, it relates to what we talked about before, which is the politics of gentrification, of ownership. A lot of the newer stuff is commissioned works. A lot of those are commissioned by businesses. I talked about Marcos Raya. He was in the lower left-hand corner of my interview slide. He is a feisty OG Pilsen artist, and he calls it taco art. So he's like smoking in his gigantic suit. He's like, man, I don't paint any fucking taco art. All these people want now is taco art. I painted art that was about something. I wanted to uplift this community. Well, not that, but I wanted to make my vision known. Like, that's a true artist. Now they want Frida Kahlo eating their fucking tacos, like, and I told you I'm agnostic. Shall embrace all art with this project, but like, he's not wrong. Like, there is something about the commercialization of muralism right now that has me very nervous. Including a lot of condo developers are building a budget for muralism into their development costs. Part of that is this, I'm don't quote me on this, I'm not exactly sure, but the city might require some percentage toward a public art fund. But to me, muralism is no longer community oriented or community driven when it is a condo developer commissioning something to hipsterize their building and to make their building, frankly, more valuable. That is a generational difference between a lot of the artists that we're seeing right now. I kind of hinted that I had some tea on some interesting community fights right now. And the biggest fight we're seeing is that older generation of artists who barely profited or barely eked out a living from doing art versus very social media savvy younger artists who are working largely on commission. So if I could just take a second to give you a contrast, there's Hector Duarte, that guy who studied under the Mexican masters, who has lived in Pilsen since about 1970, who has remained in Pilsen, has raised 4 kids in his studio / home right off of 18th Street. He is heavily commissioned. He is a working artist. He never got rich off of it, but he's made a good living. But his art is first and foremost community oriented and community minded. A few months ago, I interviewed an artist named Cesar Perez, who started off as a graffiti artist, like a lot of the younger generation. They started tagging, and then they went to like art school, and then they became a professional. He lives in he lives rent free because he does commissions for his landlord all over the city. He is extremely business oriented in his approach and unapologetic about it, which he yelled at me in the interview too. Like both people yelled at me. The first, the older generation says, these youngsters are about themselves. We were about community. And the younger generation yells at us to say, I got to make a living. Art is not free. It is an entrepreneurial mindset that it's hard to get mad at, because the guy's a gifted artist, and I don't want to put those kinds of walls around artists of color to say that like mainstream artists or white artists should profit from their art, but Cesar Perez, because he's Latino, should be doing art for the community. He should be doing art pro bono. He should be doing art to uplift his and promote his culture. That I'm not okay with, because that's a different set of standards for working artists. And a lot of artists of color have had to carry the baggage that they represent their entire community in a way that white artists haven't. And that's a conflict I obviously can't solve as an outsider doing this research.
Hi, Dr. Ruiz. It's Annie.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting. And that piece about developers including like a line item in their budget for muralism is super fascinating. And it gets at one thing that I was curious to know more about, which is this issue of gray washing and the relationship between developers and community members. If you could talk a little bit more about that, I'd love to hear, how community members have mobilized to push back against developers and gentrification, and kind of what the future of gentrifying Pilsen looks like. And another one of our students, Stephanie, had a question about if there's space set aside for future murals in Pilsen. So sort of like the future of gentrifying Pilsen and what muralism will look like in the years to come.
Both really good questions. Space set aside is a good way to put it, but the short answer to that is no. It's not necessary. There's thousands of walls that are unpainted in Pilsen that provide an endless canvas for muralism. So space should be of no concern whatsoever going forward. What is of concern is the first thing you mentioned, which is that relationship between developers and the community. So to answer your question, yes, there has been lots of pushback to developers. Some hipster restaurants have gotten bomb threats. Some hipster developers have gotten bricks through the window. A restaurant shut down a few years ago because they could not make peace with the neighborhood. Too many activists were harassing them, and someone threw a brick through the window, and the restaurant shut down because the mindset of the activism of the activists was that Pilsen is not for sale and that outsiders had no right to come in and create businesses like, you know, a hipster cocktail bar or whatever it was. I think I'm running out of time, so I think I can close on a note that is especially relevant to your question and say this. There is, however, activism against the developers. So Hector Duarte, that guy that I keep mentioning, of that older generation, he has partnered with artists from multiple generations, from people in their teens to himself in his 70s, and they've started an organization that's buying decrepit buildings in Pilsen, sort of from under developers. Excuse me. And they're creating affordable housing options in the neighborhood. So right across the street from the museum, in fact, is one of these buildings. And it is like one of the biggest pieces of public art in Pilsen, because they have covered like every inch of this 4-story building with like 2 wings in murals. And to me, it is an excellent counterpoint to the gray washing that we've been talking about, because instead of a developer coming in trying to make it neutral and expensive, sort of aesthetically and economically, they have made it loud and aggressive in your face, and they're working on creating options so that people can live in Pilsen at an affordable rate. I am a college professor at a very fancy place. I recently bought an apartment in Chicago, and I could not afford the cheapest apartment I found in Pilsen. It is ridiculously expensive. So despite that activism that I'm championing, my prediction for the next 10 years, as Christopher asked in the Q&A, is I think the demographics will keep going in the direction that they have been going in, which is that Pilsen will become less Latino, but probably covered in more murals, because at the end of the day, like in the cold, hard light of day, I think that the murals are still getting painted, but they mean something very different in a gentrifying neighborhood. They don't really mean what they used to, which was about community uplift. They used to be, and I realize I'm sounding like one of those old timers, but from my scholarly understanding, I would say that the murals tended to reflect a marginalized community creating space for themselves in a somewhat hostile city. And now a lot of them more closely resemble the taco art that Marcos Raya is talking about.
All right, well, thank you. That's a great place to end. Thank you. Another round of applause for Dr. Ruiz. Really, this was fantastic and so relevant to our class, and we'll have a lot to pick up on, a lot of threads to pick up on. So thank you so much. I'm sorry to hear that it's snowing. That's awful. So hopefully you have
I don't know how I'm
nice
going to get
warm
home.
Yes, there you go. Exactly.